Welcome to the Crazy Wisdom Podcast. I've got David Pope here, who is a previous guest and is also the commissioner of the Wyoming Stable Token. And then I've also got Director Anthony Apollo here to talk about the same thing. And welcome to the show.
Thank you for having us. Yes.
So Wyoming, what is the latest on the Wyoming stablecoin token?
Well, first off, I do want to make sure that the audience understands that anything that we say is not an action or decision of the Stable Token Commission, and may not be official policy of the commission. It is on my part and Director Apollo's part. It is oftentimes our opinion and what we feel about it, as opposed to decisions that have been made. And so that I think that's important to note as well, especially here in this great space you've created, Stewart, that it's a comfortable conversation. It may lead into places that we were not necessarily asked to go to often. So keep that in mind. And I am David Pope. I'm one of the 7 commissioners that have been selected and put in place by the Wyoming legislature. Those include the governor of Wyoming, the state auditor, and the state treasurer, along with 4 subject matter experts on the commission, one of which is me. And I'm also here to introduce Executive Director Anthony Apollo, and I'll let him do a quick introduction for himself, so that then we can move on into all of those cool little areas that you want to attack.
There's a lot there.
Great. Thank you, Commissioner. And thank you, Stewart, again for having us today. So my name is Anthony Apollo. I am currently serving as the Executive Director of the Wyoming Stable Token Commission. I've been in this role, I think, a week shy of 18 months. And before I was in this role, I had no expectation of being in state government or any kind of government policy or lobbying position. I actually spent the first half of my career more in the traditional finance side of things, working for some of the large banks in the wake of the '08 financial crisis, particularly around helping them restructure their reporting when Dodd-Frank was put forward and they needed to kind of meet a higher regulatory standard. And then when I spent enough time seeing how banks work, or often do not work all that well, and learned about Bitcoin and Ethereum at the same time, which had been the fall of 2015 for me, started tracking more and more in that direction. Joined a firm called Consensus back in the fall of 2017. And between Consensus and my own personal startups, I've worked on everything from tokenized intellectual property, real-time payouts to content creators, codified royalties via smart contract, and at one point even worked on a compliant debt security token with an NBA athlete. That would be Spencer Dinwiddie, formerly on the Brooklyn Nets, now on the Mavericks after a stint on the Lakers, which had a monthly payout in stable tokens to holders of that tokenized bond. So I've been on both sides of the world. Moved to Wyoming back in 2021 because of the very permissive legislative framework the state's created around cryptocurrency, blockchain, digital assets. And Commissioner Pope is one of a few people who've had a real driving force behind that. So I always thank him for his efforts along the last, at this point, I think about decade of working on this stuff. And we could take it from there.
Brilliant. You just gave me a lot of different things we can go into. I just did an interesting interview with David Packham a week ago on Chintai, which is tokenizing real world assets. And until that interview, I didn't realize that most real world assets outside of property or art are not real world. They're not physical things. They're tokenized debt or tokenized equity. That was an idea that was kept on coming back, is that we can actually kind of create an IPO. I'm not saying you guys or anything like that. We can create an IPO before an IPO using tokenized real world assets. That's like one of the potential things coming down the pipeline. So you said a lot of things. The tokenized bond. What is a tokenized bond?
Oh, yeah. So Commissioner Pope, if you want to please give the background for that, and then I'll go into the specifics of what it looks like to get an NBA athlete to do one of those.
Oh, and so this could be like a 5 hour podcast, and because the granularity which we can get into on this is incredible. But the great thing about it is that we are truly at the dawn of tokenized real world assets, and right now you're right. There are no true tokenized real world assets, and I'll tell you why. Right now, all you can do is you can buy equity in tokens, or you can buy debt in tokens.
Interesting.
And because the equity real world assets have to be owned by someone, and tokens are not yet recognized as someone. So whether it's a limited liability company or a corporation, if you tokenize that asset, what you're really tokenizing is the ownership agent.
That's
So
interesting. So there needs to be, it's like we talked about last time, with the Wyoming, the LLC, it's like that hasn't been put into place yet.
right. So the next step is to make the token the title. So once you make the token the title, then a person can own a piece of the actual asset in a tenancy in common relationship, or in a joint tenancy, or in a sole relationship to that asset, without needing to own a piece of the equity or debt on that particular asset. So yeah, that's the next step, but it is also one that has not been taken, as far as I know, in a real way anywhere yet.
Yeah,
so
interesting. And so there's a question I want to come back to later about that specific thing and how much that has to do with a stable coin. Sorry, a stable token in Wyoming. And whether that's part of the plan, and whether the stable token is the infrastructure that needs to be set up for that, or how that's related. But before that, I would love to go into, Anthony, can you talk more about like this MBA star?
Can do. So when I was at Consensus, shortly before leaving, we were spinning up a vertical within the company that would focus on fan engagement kind of writ large. We were talking to a lot of sports organizations, really marquee organizations all around the world, before Consensus went through a bit of a pivot at the end of 2018 and to focus on infrastructure. And one of the clients we were kind of lining up was Spencer Dinwiddie, then again of the Brooklyn Nets. And then when me and my team left Consensus, he kind of came along as a client with us, had pretty big ideas for what he wanted to accomplish with digital assets, generally speaking. I mean, he forgetting the phrase, he would market himself as a tech guy with a jumper. So, almost as if the NBA, as playing as a professional basketball player, was like a background thing for him. But he wanted to, NFTize his shoes. He was looking for ways to incorporate blockchain to his philanthropic efforts. And we looked at all of this and we said, what can we get done in maybe 6-ish months that there's precedent for, but no one's really manifested yet. So we looked at the Bowie bonds, which you may know as the Pullman bonds, Commissioner Pope, which were essentially how David Bowie bought the rights back to his music with debt. And there's a whole, again, speaking of long backstories, the whole backstory there about how the advent of Napster at the same time as that deal going on turned those from, like, I think A-rated to junk bonds functionally overnight. Different conversation. Wow. But we looked at that, and we looked at a company called Fantex, which is more on the equity side, where there was essentially shares of athletes that were listed that you could buy, predominantly football players. And that had some issues because football players get injured very often, and that has implications for securities related to them. So we went in the direction of doing a debt issuance pertaining to Spencer and his work, essentially, not only as an athlete, but all of his personal endeavors, all the kind of sponsorships and things. So it was kind of a bond with a personal guarantee behind it, more so than this claim that we were tokenizing his NBA contract, which is what made into the headlines in ESPN. And then we had to have a lot of difficult conversations with the NBA and Players Association as a result of that, because you can't assign contracts. Again, this is its own long story. But essentially what we did was, even as far back as 2019, 2020, we did have a tokenized security. It was a formal Reg D filing, which again is a little bit different than what Commissioner Pope is talking about. We actually had to go through, the SEC and the regulators here, and we buttoned it all up. Used Securitize for the token issuance, used Paxos for the stable token that we distributed to the token holders every month. And there was multiple law firms, insurance companies. There was like 12 to 14 different organizations involved by the end of it, which, maybe is a nice segue to the Wyoming Stable Token where we are now. It's not too surprising that I'm back to trying to put together a offering with 8 different vendors, one commission that rolls up to a select committee that rolls up to a legislature. So a lot of stakeholders once again, but certainly not my first rodeo.
Yeah. Okay. There's a more again we can go into the idea of a bond, and it's just there's a whole new world of finance that I'm getting insight into, particularly in terms of the finance and the legal aspect, and that's really interesting. Let's go into the stable coin or stable token. The what is it? What's going on? Why do we need it now?
Director
Commissioner,
Apollo.
feel free to take that. I'm happy to take that one.
Okay, so let me just, as far as the history goes, let's start out with that. Back in 2017, when I started in the effort, it was one of my first thoughts was that Wyoming, of course, because of all of the fiat difficulties and the same reason there's Bitcoin and all of that, I thought Wyoming needed its own cryptocurrency. That was shot down really quickly because of the constitutional implications of that. And so what we wanted to do moving forward from there was figure out a way for Wyoming to have a means of exchange that was separate in many ways from traditional fiat, but provided all of the efficiencies of having the payments recorded on blockchain, having instantaneous transfer of the asset, having the ability to segue into a world where transactions, everyday transfers, everyday international transfers, and eventually, possibly everyday transactions appear on the blockchain. Those asset transfers that those represent, a cup of coffee for $5 of stable token, can be on chain and can be, for me, that means if it's on chain, it's auditable. And if it's auditable, it creates an entire movement into self-auditing financial statements and things like that. As a CPA, for me, that's like magic. That's incredible.
Because it can be done programmatically.
Yes. And so that's kind of my history with it. What it's morphed into is an effort that will create a huge number of efficiencies throughout the world with the transfer of capital. Why the state and why we should do it instead of some of the other players that are already in the field, because on the basis of our legislation, we are required to be solid. We are required to be fully backed. We are required to be auditable on a regular basis, and that provides certainty to the TradFi world that they can use this in the same way and with the same security as being able to transfer cash.
So a lot there. Just there's been so much going on with Delaware recently. A lot of people are moving away from Delaware. I think in our last one we talked about how Wyoming was the innovator of the LLC. which got popular somewhere else first. Well, no, it got popular in Delaware. I think that was it was innovated inside of Wyoming and then went to Delaware. Was that right? Am I remembering that right?
That is correct. Yes.
Yeah. And so there's a history of innovation of essentially creating this. Are there other states, not even US states, but are there other countries who are going after a similar type of thing? I mean, the United States is such an interesting place because of our laboratory of democracy and the states' rights versus the federal government, which many people outside of our country are commenting on our political situation and have no idea how different it is from other places. What's going on? Like, what's the global playing field? Any other US states or any other nation states?
I'll chime in on this one. Yeah. So there are really no other states working on this. There's been some mild discussion about Texas doing a gold-backed version of a stable token. I don't really consider commodities to be stable tokens, right? They do change in price. It's stable by weight. And I kind of bucket that into the real world asset side of things. But from my perspective, yeah, we're the only state working on it. It is interesting to see and receive outreach from many other states recently as a result of the new administration, the President's Council of Advisors on digital assets, the working groups that are being spun up, and even beyond that, the discussions around the strategic Bitcoin reserve, which, you could talk about how that's kind of panned out state by state and the variances between them. But all that to say is there's more excitement about digital assets. And a lot of the calls that I'm getting are from states looking to set up a blockchain or digital asset task force, which Commissioner Pope was part of back in 2016. So we really kind of front ran this in the state of Wyoming. And that's kind of the domestic perspective that I've got. Internationally, to my knowledge, there's no other nation states working on a fiat-backed and fully reserved stablecoin, which is functionally what we're doing, right? We're going to look fairly similar to Circle or PYUSD from PayPal out the gate. We could talk more about some of the efficiencies we'll have and benefits of a Wyoming stable token beyond that.
Yeah, interesting.
But other nations are predominantly working on CBDCs.
Yeah.
And I think, well, the CBDC, central bank digital currency, is inherently issued by a central bank, so the federal bank, kind of analog of that nation. If you were to look at the legislation that's just come out in the House or Senate, both of those define what a CBDC is and say we are not that. And around the world, especially in the EU, there's more of a push for a CBDC, a digital euro that would be managed by the central bank.
Yeah.
We're talking about a token that is backed by dollars and treasuries, right? So it looks less like a currency. It's not a currency, right? It's backed by a currency and other debt and short duration treasuries. Whereas in a central bank digital currency is essentially a euro or a yen on a blockchain. And that has some interesting ramifications. I'm not saying this is necessarily true of any of the ones I just mentioned, but the concern there is, well, if we've got $36 trillion of debt in the US. If someone has the ability to just print more dollars now in a digital format, you don't even need to go through the process of doing physical dollar printing, which is scary. And there's a lot of concerns around privacy as well. Can your ability to transact be shut off by a government that doesn't like what you're saying online? I mean, that is functionally what is happening overseas in China. So there's some big concerns to CBDCs, and that's why you've seen Donald Trump come out in stern opposition to them. And even before the second Trump administration, people like Representative Tom Emmer and others working on CBDC prohibition bills.
Okay, very interesting. And will the stable token? So it'll be backed by the dollar or U.S. Treasuries. I mean, just in general, it's a fascinating idea because it's essentially going to extend. I mean, the U.S. dollar is already digital. It's just digital in the sense that the Treasury can and the Federal Reserve can essentially make changes to it. And correct me if I'm wrong. You guys definitely have more experience in this realm than I do. So like the U.S. Treasuries are already basically digital. Money is digital. It's all in databases. And now what Wyoming is doing is creating a legislator, a background, a framework, so that this can actually happen can we go more into like what it requires for a state to get involved? Because we talk about Tether, we can talk about Tron, we can talk about Binance. All of them have stable coins. Circle, the Coinbase ones, they all use stable coins. It's very interesting to be down here in Buenos Aires, because I went from the United States where stable coins didn't make sense to me. I wasn't moving in and out of assets. Like, I'm just a long-term holder. I'm not somebody who's moving in and out. So like, they didn't really make sense for me there. I moved to Argentina, and all of a sudden it's like a daily part of my life where I'm using US dollar stable coins all the time. Like every day I now use them. And so it's fascinating to then consider like what is the uniqueness of a government entering into that, and not only a government, maybe for our listeners who are not from the States, what does a state government like that look like?
Yeah, so Commissioner Pope, I could quickly answer the question on kind of the backing and the digitization of the dollar, and I'll turn over to you for the legislative side and how that's manifested some of the benefits and differences. So with the Wyoming stable token, statutorily, so again, by law, we are only allowed to keep our holdings in a combination of cash, U.S. Treasury securities with 365 days or less to maturity, and U.S. Treasury security repurchase agreements with 30 days or less to maturity. So these are really short duration instruments that will help de-risk the backing of it. Because if you remember what happened with Circle and SVB, there's certainly a lot to say about that. But part of the issues, they were pretty far out on the bond curve. So you had very low rates on the 30-year versus higher rates on a short duration one. You want to get closer to the short duration. You don't want to be that far out. So, and you see, if you look at the guidance from the New York Department of Financial Services, or again, the Genius Act or the Staple Act that have recently been publicized by our domestic House and Senate, those focus a lot on kind of a tight band around those reserves. I'd also go as far as say, in terms of digitization of the dollar, I would agree that your dollars are already functionally digital on databases, like you said. Well, that's in the bank, and I would also add the payment rails, right? It's you swipe your credit card, you use Venmo. It's all pretty much there already. And I would assume and expect that when a Wyoming stable token gets launched, you'd be able to use it peer-to-peer from wallet to wallet, but it would be, if not maybe at launch, maybe on day two, integrated into some of those more traditional looking rails as well. Commissioner Pope, I'll turn it over to you to talk about how this legislative framework came about, and again, what the implications are for the state and dollar generally.
Well, and we can get into a number of areas here. First off, I went to a presentation down in Denver by an MIT economist that basically said, and I can't remember whether she said it was 70% or 80%, but if you hold a dollar in your hand, or if you have if you have a dollar in your bank account, 80 cents of that dollar is nothing more than restructured debt.
Whoa.
And so when you think of that as the framework, and then or as background, and you also think of the fact that the dollar is inflated every time someone takes a loan out of with a bank. You have an increase in the money supply due to that, and that increase in supply is inflationary in nature. What we do with the stable token is we remove one full layer of that debt just by having a stable token that itself is not inflationary. It cannot inflate the money supply because unless the
because it's fully backed.
Decides, right, because it's fully backed. Of course, the government can increase the number of bonds that are out there. But that drives up the yield, which in itself is is somewhat anti-inflationary, because the more bonds that are issued, the greater the yield that the market demands in order to move into the bond market. People who wouldn't normally be in the bond market would move there. So it's my opinion that what we do, it does not inflate the dollar. First off, it removes a layer of that incorporated debt, and it it provides even more security than its alternatives. So that's that part. Then and Anthony, from there, I have completely lost my train of thought.
No. So I want to go into legislative. What is the legal side of this? How does all that work?
Okay, so legislatively, it was a matter of creating a structure that requires a 102% backing for every token that we issue. So what that is meant to do, and then creating a framework around that, required audits, required oversight, required components that make it so that the market will trust us. And we provide and create the standard for the issuance in the future of other stable tokens.
Yeah, that's really. Oh wow, interesting. So
yeah, it was the goal of the legislature to have us become that standard, and so the 102% backing. Let's just go to that. I did an analysis of treasury yields from 1990 forward, and I found that we were right at about an average of 3% yield. And if you have a 3% yield and 102% backing, then there is a margin there that we will be able to use to help fund the state. Right now, yields are about 4.5%. There are plenty of times in history where it's dropped below 2%. So we need to have a cushion that will allow us never to depeg from the dollar. And that will also allow us to provide a significant source of revenue for the state. And the final thing I'll say on that is I don't believe that 102% is enough. And we are working right now on building models that will help us figure out what that actual backing will be by rule as opposed to by legislation.
Wait, what is the difference between rule and legislation?
Then that's the beauty of it. The legislature gave us the authority to essentially write regulations around the legislation that they created, and we have the ability to move beyond what the legislation said as far as the security of the token goes in various cases, and we're trying to find that balance right now where we will never be depegged.
Because that's the risk, right? Because we have a whole bunch of non-governmental entities that are inside the currency process, providing huge leverage for a lot of people making interesting decisions all over the world in terms of meme coins and all sorts of other things. And then we've got a market that just keeps on just going up and then crashing and going up with the volatility, which is normal in Bitcoin. There's nothing, it's just that is the nature of the thing that we're in. But then we've also got this crazy element of people that are not transparent in terms of the private companies, right? So I really like this juxtaposition of a government thing, and it's not the federal government either. It's just so crazy how history works and how we've just the United States experiment is such a different thing than the rest of the world.
And the real thing here is we want to provide a bridge, or I want to provide a bridge between what was before and what is going to be the future. And if you look at traditional finance, if there's a danger that they're going to wire money or send a stable token, General Motors is going to send and order $1 billion worth of parts from a manufacturer overseas, and they're going to use the stable token to affect that the transfer payment for those parts. They want to make sure that it's still worth $1 that after, from the time they buy it
Yeah,
to the
interesting.
time it's sent to the time it's received, which will be about 3 milliseconds later at that point, which de-risks international transfers.
Why? Oh, because the international transfers are 2 to 5 days or whatever.
Yeah, the SWIFT system is not a great system, and that's one of the things that that we will capitalize on. The fact that the international finance community hasn't figured out a way to fix that dead time where you could have major fluctuations in currency rates. Sorry, I don't mean to capitalize this. Directly.
I want to add an anecdote on the end of this that I think is relevant and you'll find funny. So I attended a breakfast not too long ago with some members of the banking lobby, and I was kind of that was kind of the walking into the lion's den situation where the stable token guy was walking into the banking meeting. And because, I mean, to be clear, I do think there are plenty of ways for banks to get involved with stable tokens. They look different, and we could talk about what that may be. But there was a lobbyist there who knew who I was and immediately went down the rabbit hole of, who needs stable tokens? What's the points? What do they do? Banks do all of this. They do it better. And I'm like, well, they don't. If I could send, a token with X amount of value, and I do mean X, it could be a couple of cents, it could be billions of dollars. If I could send that to the other side of the world, have it in a block that takes seconds to reach finality, if that, I could pay 64 thousandths of a cent to accomplish that and have minimal counterparty risk because I'm going peer to peer. That is functionally a more efficient system. And then this gentleman tried to tell me that the Commissioner Public just mentioned Swift, which is what reminded me of this, that, Swift can do that if it just had, the ability to do asset transfers in addition to messaging, then you'd have a better product. And I said, a platform that could do messaging and asset transfers is called a blockchain, and we have them already. So,
wait, okay. So 3 questions. The message part is interesting. I want to understand what that means. But and I guess this isn't a question, but the velocity of money. It feels like the velocity of money is about to be increased. I mean, and that happened in the previous version during COVID and during 2008. When they put so much money into the system, they created a whole bunch of velocity. So we could talk about philosophically what that means. I want to understand, what is counterparty risk, or what is the counterparty risk in the current system?
Well, it's the risk that the person on the other side doesn't receive that funding, right? If I have to send money to someone on the other side of the world, and it needs to go through 8 different correspondent banks to get there, going to country through this patchwork of different financial institutions, there is risk of loss. There is arbitrage that comes up as a result of the timing that needs to wind through all those banks. There is the risk that you are going to have somewhere along the way some nefarious actor that might try to interdict things. And you may also just generally have a bunch of damn fees. So why deal with all of that if I can go, if Commissioner Pope is in Okinawa right now and I have his digital wallet address, I could just send him 10 Wyoming stable tokens, and he's got it by the time I'm done rambling at the end of the sentence.
Yeah, it's the peer-to-peer nature of it, and that's what crypto allowed. And I now have a question, like, how did crypto allow peer-to-peer? I guess it's Bitcoin. Bitcoin allowed peer-to-peer transfers of value, and it's because of the public and the private key address that they were able to have a unique identifier, sort of like the linkage between 2 things, which I've been learning that's the whole internet as well. And so this is now a somewhat government sort of thing, or a government thing that's offering an alternative to the current private networks that are out there. And there's an interesting place I wanted to go with that. It's the computation, because there's a operating system out there called Urbit, and Urbit tried to do peer-to-peer computation in a way, because right now our current computation system is set up so that our conversation right now is going through a server that sits on Zoom's cloud, that's fully owned by them, and creates the counterparty risk if it's not clear right now that there's like in Zoom's probably not going to do anything to us or anything like that. But that's a problem that it's going to the server. So why can't we just compute directly by each of us having a server and choosing? And so that's what they tried to do. It didn't really work out. I am hopeful that it comes again, because the artificial intelligence question is going to necessitate this type of computation, but maybe not in the immediate future. So I really, this idea of it unlocked something about the peer-to-peer nature of finance. Where does this go in the future? I know it's a hard question, but like for either of you guys, where are we headed as the global order just starts to pretty radically change? Where does this piece of technology fit into the global order?
Well, the technology fits in that it continues to link people, economies, and structures. As far as governmental structures, the governmental structures that we have now, in some ways, deteriorate, and mainly because people are linked more closely directly. But we're not seeing the end of any government because of this anytime soon. It's just not.
It's a relative multipolar type of thing.
It's the same reason some countries now cannot wage war against each other, because they are now linked too closely on an economic basis. And this just strengthens those types of things. The second thing is it really does, what we're doing really does help maintain and strengthen the US dollar. Gosh, I always wrap my my vocal cords around this word, hegemony. Hegemony. Director Apollo, can you feel, because the government,
hegemony, U.S. dollar hegemony.
That's it. Hegemony.
And if you get stuck on that one, just say the U.S. dollar's role as the world's reserve currency, as the backup plan.
But the governor spoke very eloquently about this in an op-ed that he wrote, that he put together and released. And I think that that's where I got the word hegemony, and just didn't. It may prove a little of my ignorance, but that's really the first time I've tried to use it in a sentence. So forgive that. But anyway, Director Apollo, I think you can carry it from there, because I think you've looked at this really closely as far as how this affects the world order in itself.
Absolutely. So, as Commissioner Pope already alluded to, right, stable tokens, stable coins can have pretty profound impacts for the US dollar's role as the world's reserve currency. And there's a couple implications to that, right? So let's start with, again, just with the efficiency we've been talking about. Having a more efficient dollar means bolstering its role in international transactions. Now, if you look at Forex transactions, yes, it's still north of 90% of them are ultimately settled in dollars, and that's great. But we also had some actions, particularly sanctions by prior administrations, that used the US dollar and specifically the SWIFT system as a way to cut off other countries and penalize them monetarily when they didn't want to do it militarily. And as a result of that, you've seen the amount of kind of the average amount of dollars held by sovereign wealth funds or in nation state coffers, for lack of a better term, drop from like 80%-ish to 50%-ish. And that's a big delta. You look at that and juxtapose that against two other key happenings. One is the further alignment and growth of the BRICS Plus coalition. So Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa started that way. But now you could put Egypt and a whole host of other countries in there. Yeah. And the big one that I'm keeping an eye on is whether or not Saudi Arabia will join. And that may have happened, they had talked about it at the end of 2023, that it would happen in 2024. It hasn't happened yet. And we'll see if that actually does manifest. But, right up against that is the fact that after 50 years, we came off the petrodollar agreement with Saudi Arabia, right, which is trillions of dollars of oil, essentially denominated in dollars. Now it doesn't have to be anymore. And people have made a lot of noise about this. Well, was ever a formal agreement, or was it never signed, or what have you? It doesn't matter. The fact of the matter is, for 50 years, barrels of oil were denominated in dollars, and now that we are at a point where some of them are not. It's not a material number right now, but there's nothing stopping it by end of this year from being a material number. So again, if you have dollars that are more easy to settle, more efficient, and perhaps are less leveraged as geopolitical tools, that could be a big benefit for the dollar itself. And again, there's further pieces here. Another one that I'll quickly point to is the amount of outstanding debt that we have in the U.S. You got $36 trillion of debt. Now, how's the government issue debt? Typically, it's through these treasuries. Well, who's buying treasuries? Well, there's businesses that do it. There's foreign nations that do it. The concern is foreign nations are, some of them, including China, are selling theirs off, right? China sold about 25%, and they're the second biggest holder of the U.S. debt. They've sold about 25%, I think, in the last 3-ish years. If you look at Japan, they're number one, but if you recall, we had the yen carry trade unwinding late last year, right? That's a somewhat precarious market as well. If they need a whole bunch of capital, they might sell off. And if you have a lot of sell activity when, as Commissioner Pope alluded to earlier, the U.S. government needs to sell debt. If there's no one to buy debt, you have a failed treasury auction that has massive economic implications for everybody, not just Wyoming, not just the stable token. That is a global financial event that will make 2008 look like a joke. So just one last point, and then I'll wrap up. So just real quick. So stable tokens as a net buyer of U.S. debt, if you were to take all the fiat-backed stable tokens and put them together, in aggregate, they would be, if you compared them against the foreign nations, they'd be in the top 15 to 20 holders of U.S. debt. And that was when stable token market cap was like 170. So we're at $220 billion of stable tokens now. And their transfer volume has already eclipsed the payment rails of Visa and others. So this is the direction it's going in.
There's a lot of info there, a lot of very interesting info that I want to go into all those points. The specific one is the idea that these U.S. Treasury, or that the stable tokens act as one of these parties, not like Japan or China, but they're acting as one of those parties, and that can increase. But that would just be bringing in more businesses, more investors. It's almost like shifting outside of the stock market, because that's the way that the common man can, what do they call it? They call it retail. That's the way that retail can participate in investment. But now we've got this other thing that can't really be regulated in the same way. I'm going on decentralized exchanges now, and like I hear about this token, and then I go and buy the token completely decentralized. And so that's a really interesting world. And it brings me back to the question I've been asking a lot recently, which is, and it relates to this legislation that we've been discussing, is that Argentina seems really interesting because up until recently with the meme coin stuff, before that, it was a perfect storm for having high level, federal level interest in creating beneficial innovation in terms of crypto, and you have the bottom up. It's one of the only countries in the world that had both of those pieces. The meme coin stuff complicated things because it essentially put a little bit of a darkness on the Argentine situation. But it's just like the states need to get involved if crypto is to become an active way that replaces some of the collapsing institutions that we talked about. Do either of you agree? Do either of you disagree? Anything you come up with that?
Well, I will say one thing, kind of dovetailing off a previous point Commissioner Pope made, and then I'll turn it back over to him, which is maybe less about collapse and more about what we could do to stop that. We had talked about the legislation, we had talked about rules, and you had asked about what the difference between legislation and rules are. We talked about the law versus what the commission's able to do. I want to double down on the rules that we have been empowered to put forth as an agency. And this is kind of with the great power comes great responsibility kind of situation here. Yes, it's great that we have the ability to put some of this forth ourselves. And we are moving at a pace where what comes out of our commission may outpace the federal legislation,
Interesting.
which is interesting. But I said all because I think it's a huge selling point for us. When we have a Wyoming stable token live, it's not going to be like the privately issued incumbents where they have terms and conditions that they can change on a whim. We need to promulgate our rules in a public forum. It's a 45-day public comment period. And if the public doesn't like what we're doing, we are going to hear about it. And it's going to have a material impact on what we're able to do. Further, for the end user of a Wyoming stable token, they are going to have a very granular roadmap for how we're able to use it. And we've talked a little bit about the reserve management already. That's downstream of the statutory requirements, and that's where we get some more granular detail about the timing for returning funds to people in fiat when they want to do a redemption, et cetera. What's more exciting than that even is the fact that we're going to be one of the first public entities that I'm aware of making actual rules about the token treatment itself, right? So the minting and issuance, the burning and redemption, any kind of action we need to take on the token. Like we need to put all of that into rules that need to be promulgated in the state. So when there's concerns around, nation states using meme coins, to come back around to your point, that is about as far afield as possible from what it is that we're doing here, where we are going through excruciating effort and research to make sure that what we're putting forth is very well fortified and very well informed. And Commissioner Polk, I'll turn it back over to you before I keep rambling on here.
Wow, I don't have a whole lot to add to that, because when we will set the standard, and we will be the standard. Which, I mean, with that, as Director Apollo said, with great power comes great responsibility. What we want to make certain of is that privacy advocates will be comfortable using our stable token. That large corporations will want to use our stable token because it helps de-risk their both international and domestic transfers. We want eventually for us to be able to expand the use, and we want to do it in a way that where our rules and our structure prevents things like the creation of derivatives on it, which would affect the value. You talked earlier about tokenizing real world assets.
Yeah.
I can see
that's
dozens
a derivative, right?
Yeah. Well, yeah, it in itself is a derivative, but let's say you tokenize a piece of real estate, you can turn that into multiple tokens underneath, one that splits off the income from that real estate, one that splits off the capital appreciation, one that is a temporary token and reverts back to the original owner, one that can't revert back. It's a never-ending world of derivatives when you turn a real-world asset into a financial asset. But one of the problems with fiat currency in itself is that we have 1,000,001 derivatives underneath the original issuance of that dollar or that euro or that yen or any of that. And so we really do need to create the structure by which all of this can come together, and we can provide that bridge between traditional finance and the Web3 world that is comfortable and secure.
So interesting. It's such an interesting world we're headed into. So one really quick question. I know you guys got to go in a few minutes, and maybe we can put a pin on it for another later one. Is Wyoming going to do a strategic Bitcoin reserve? Is that in the plans?
So that bill was already put forth this year and did not
go through.
I believe it died in committee.
Yeah.
So it was introduced, made it to committee, and then did not make it through the committee itself. I'm not going to say a whole lot about that, but what I will say is I've seen when the strategic Bitcoin reserve started getting talked about and states started looking at it, and different lobby groups were putting forth legislation amongst states around setting this up. There were some pretty wild numbers on there, right? Take 10% of your general fund and put it into Bitcoin. The general fund should be the most stable dollars you possibly have, right? That's salaries, that's pensions, that's support for families and what you need. So you don't want to be doing that, especially, and we've seen since then, Bitcoin has collapsed about 20-25%. So if you're stuck with 10% of your fund is now 25% gone, you need those dollars. It's not a great place to be. Where I think Wyoming would have had a stronger shot at getting it done and more secure environment is we had some very smart planners many decades ago that created several permanent funds, which are really not meant to be touched. Where essentially there's, when companies come here and extract minerals out of the ground, that goes into the permanent minerals fund. We have a permanent land fund. And those are several tens of billions of dollars each, I believe, based on severance taxes and other things. And, having the version of Wyoming's Bitcoin bill, for lack of a better term, would have kind of isolated the general fund and then created a carve out where you could have up to 3% in either of those permanent funds. And again, it was a may, not a shall, so it wasn't a diktat, it was an option. And I think that could have worked as a better model than what I've seen proposed elsewhere. And I'll probably end my commentary on it there before I get on a soapbox.
Well, thank you so much for coming on the show. How can people find out more about either of your work or the Stable Token Commission?
Yep. So we are at stabletoken.wyo.gov. We have everything running off of a Notion page for right now. I'm very proud to say that everything we do is public. All of our documentation from every meeting, every recording, all the minutes, and up to and including the blockchain selection exercise that we performed with 24 criteria assessing 30 different chains. If you want to know how we made our decisions, the links are right there.
Brilliant.
And I will end up by saying, watch the Select Committee on Blockchain in Wyoming, the Legislative Select Committee, because I will be bringing a package of enhancement ideas this interim session, and I find them really exciting. I'm not going to go into them right now because they are not finalized and on my end, but I am looking as forward to this next session as I was when we were bringing the stable token to the legislature. So this is going to be fun. Watch for that. Watch for our meetings. They're all online. They're all fully transparent, which is really something unique and special that Wyoming has that no other state that I know of has.
Beautiful. Thank you both.